Hello to anyone listening, and welcome to The Patriotic Communist. This is Max Rice, and this is the podcast where I advocate for a socialist revolution in the United States of America, and where I analyze current events from a far-left perspective. We are in the historical context where we choose socialism or barbarism, and that has never been more true. Hey guys, sorry it's been a while. I'm talking about the aftermath of the 22 election and my thoughts on it, and developments just kept on popping up. So I had to wait a while to type everything. I kept on starting my script and then hearing about more info and whatnot. Anyways, I apologize for the late release. I will release a new episode at some point the week after next week. And also, just by the way, my school term is finishing up, so there's a solid chance that I will start releasing a podcast every week for a month or so. But anyways, enough of that. Let's get into it. So Joe Biden is going to be our next president. This is what I predicted right before the election, although I predicted Trump would win when Joe Biden won the nomination. I was not surprised at all to see how close it was, and I even thought Trump was going to win it for a bit. Pretty much for the whole election night, I thought that Trump was going to win. It seems as though, when everything is counted completely, Joe Biden beat Trump by about the same margin as Trump beat Clinton in 2016, even more, when you look at the popular vote. But he beat him by the popular vote by a significant margin. So, although the Electoral College victory for Biden is similar to that of Trump, if not the same actually, point-wise, I'm not sure, Joe Biden still got a lot more of the popular vote than Trump ever has. So I think that's an important point to make. Now, some predictable developments have happened since election night, and as of the time I'm writing this, Donald Trump seems to not want to concede the election, and he's making a lot of big accusations of the election being stolen from him without providing any real evidence. And if a Trump voter happened to be listening to this, I understand why you might think it was rigged. I really do. This whole election has been bizarre, especially because of the way that people vote during a pandemic, which no one in our lifetime knows what that would look like for an election with the state that the country's in right now and how many voters there are compared to back when the population was a lot smaller. So I understand why you might think it was rigged, like how the Democrats rigged the election against Bernie Sanders. The problem with this is that there's no real evidence. And I think there is logic that points, actually I know that there is lots of logic that points at the Republicans being the cause of more election fraud than the Democrats would during the presidential election. There's no conceivable way for the Democrats to do what it is that Donald Trump and his supporters are accusing them of. And I hate the Democrats, by the way. It's the same party as the Republicans at the end of the day. Anyone that listens to the show knows that I believe that. So I'm not defending the Democrats. I'm just saying I don't know what the fuck you guys are even talking about. Higher voter turnout generally helps Democrats. So they tend to only suppress the votes during their primaries. So during a Democratic primary, the establishment wants their most right-wing person to win. So they suppress the vote. The Democrats will frequently suppress the vote during the primaries when they're deciding who's going to be the nominee to run for the president. Which means that it's not, also I want to make it clear, this means it's not below them. You know, like this is something that they do and would do more if it made more sense to do. So higher voter turnout, again, generally helps Democrats as they tend to only suppress the votes during their primaries because of that. They want a right-winger to win their primaries, and then they run against a Republican, which is usually even further to the right. All this go vote shit that you saw before this election, you saw it everywhere, where everyone was telling you to vote, 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 vote. A lot of that is actually paid for messaging from the Democratic Party. They want people to vote during the general election. It helps them with their with them trying to gain power. Neither of these parties really care about democracy. Honestly, the difference between Republicans and Democrats is barely recognizable most of the time. Nancy Pelosi agrees with Trump about a whole lot of things, and her and Chuck Schumer directly helped Trump pass his legislative agenda and get his judges into power. So, basically what I'm saying is I'm really trying to stress the point. I understand I don't understand being a Trump supporter, to be honest. It doesn't make too much sense to me. I understand that he does this right-wing populism thing, which appeals to the working class sometimes. But in general, not trusting the Democrats and thinking that they might have stolen the election, I understand this apprehension. It makes sense when you see what happened to Bernie Sanders 2 years in a row. So the thing is that me being the open-minded type of dude that could totally imagine the Democrats doing something to help them gain power and doing illegal things to do that, there's literally no evidence that they did what Trump is accusing them of. There really isn't. And just to be clear, I look at both of the parties as the same disgusting mechanism. I didn't vote for either of these warmongering racist rapists. I voted for Joseph Kishore of the Socialist Equality Party, which is a vote that I'm very proud of. Anyways, the reasons that the vote suddenly flipped to Biden, and he was even able to catch up past more than 10 points in Pennsylvania, is because of mail-in ballots. And this is the main reason people think this is the main reason Trump supporters think that the election was potentially stolen. They saw that Trump was winning by quite hefty margins in very key states, and that a lot of those states flipped around. I'm talking about Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. There's quite a few states where this happened. This is because of mail-in ballots. They started counting them on the day of the election, and there was a huge amount of them. And mail-in ballots, for whatever reason, tend to be a majority Democratic vote. They tend to be a vote for the Democrats. And this, I don't know why this is actually, but it's just a fact. And it's not like a small majority of mail-in ballots tend to be Democrat votes. It can go from like 70 to 80 something percent, depending on the state. But my point is that these mail-in ballots favor the Democrats, and they started counting them on the day of the election in a lot of key states. And there was a lot of them in these states. So this is why these states flipped. And we already knew that this was a very probable possibility going into this election. What all of the states that flipped from being red to blue late in the race had in common was that they all had a lot of mail-in votes, and they would not start counting them until the day of the election due to their state laws regarding election practices. So that's not a coincidence. The fact that that is the case lends evidence to the fact that this was not a stolen election. Now, anyone listening to this, it's like, oh my God, I don't even think this is a stolen election. There's probably no Trump supporters listening to you. I think it's important that people actually honestly debunk this concept of stealing the election. This causes political instability, and you can't blame anyone for not trusting anything, honestly. But I want you guys to know I'm just a normal guy, a normal fucking communist, to be honest. And you might hate communists if you're a Trump supporter, but dude, this was not stolen, and I have no reason to lie about that. I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but it really was not likely. In fact, a lot of people were saying that this exact scenario was going to happen, where it would seem like Trump was winning on election night, but then over the next few days, it would flip to Biden. The pundits called it the red mirage. So if you're skeptical of the Democrats stealing the election, there are some counterpoints that might convince you otherwise. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying there isn't really any evidence, and I don't believe things if there's no evidence. It is worth mentioning that the polls were horribly off, and you could make the case that the media conspired against Trump if perhaps there was some shenanigans going on with the polling that was coming out. But even that doesn't really make much sense, because there's lots of reason to believe that there would be this the hidden Trump supporter, people that tend to not be very vocal about their support for Trump. And also, I've heard a lot of people make cases that the methods of these polling organizations that do this polling are just bad. They're just outdated, and they don't work with politics nowadays. But I don't know the specifics about that. But again, I understand that seeing that is also enough of a pattern to make people very skeptical if they're Trump supporters. But there really isn't a rational case for Joe Biden stealing this election, especially when you look at all of the voting districts in states that are largely controlled by Republicans. How would the Democrats rig a presidential election when they ain't the ones counting all the votes or anything like that? There are a lot of holes in the idea that this election was stolen by Trump, and not to mention, Trump was basically telling us that he was not going to accept defeat as an option months before this election, which is even further evidence that this is a completely manufactured conspiracy theory made by Donald Trump and maybe his supporters. But regardless, a lot of people in his base will be empowered, and it is a fair fear to have that there will be domestic terrorism by rogue Trump actors, the very extremist ones, the fascistic ones. It may even be worse because there could be organized terrorism by fringe Trump supporters. And I think that all of these things are legitimate possibilities and concerns. What makes it even darker and more worrisome is that Trump has fired a lot of high-ranking members of the Pentagon, which could be the foreshadowing of an actual coup. Or a coup attempt at the very least. It could be other things, don't get me wrong, but it's troubling to see developments like that. This is the type of situation where we are all just waiting to see what happens because no one really knows what's going to happen when it comes to Trump conceding power. And empowering his base with conspiracy theories to the point of extreme civil unrest. The race was a lot closer than anyone really thought, though. And by the way, I think it is very safe to say that if this pandemic and consequential economic depression never unfolded this year, then Trump would have won easily. With the current state of our destroyed economy and horrible pandemic response, it is amazing that Trump was nearly able to win. And it really displays how absolutely terrible the Democrats are in the eyes of the citizens of the United States. They also underperformed in the congressional races. The Democrats lost seats in the House, and they did not win the Senate. They did much worse than projected. So Democrats across the board nationally underperformed. At the end of the day, though, I believe that a Joe Biden presidency is just as devastating as a Trump presidency. I think you could make the case that Joe Biden is going to be worse for our foreign policy since he could be a more competent but equally aggressive commander-in-chief. Joe Biden would get along very well with the CIA, FBI, NSA, and all the giant corporations that really control this country. Our neo-fascist state continues. And Joe Biden is not going to make any dramatic changes. He agrees with Trump about most policies. Our system is completely broken. And all of the Democrats pretending that this is going to change everything, the Joe Biden win, they're all out of their fucking mind. It wasn't as simple as Trump messed up our pandemic response. It's more accurately that capitalism messed up our pandemic response, and we were already in fucking national crisis when you look at healthcare, education, poverty, homelessness. We were already in national crisis before the pandemic. We were already in national crisis, actually, before Donald Trump. So, this country is falling to pieces with Trump or Biden. The differences are semantics. Although granted, some of the differences are important semantics, such as being comfortable and popular with fascist street militias like Trump seems to be, but also another semantic is the foreign policy thing I was talking about, where Joe Biden is exactly who the deep state wants as president. That's a problem. That's an important semantic, just like Donald Trump being seemingly comfortable and popular with fascistic street militias. The real major concerns for the United States at the moment is political unrest at the idea of Donald Trump not stepping down from power without some sort of fight. His administration is already denying conceding the election, and they are delaying the initial moves of a peaceful transfer of power. I don't know how it is going to turn out, but it is concerning without a doubt, and we will see how long Trump can keep up this delusional circus show. Although Trump will almost certainly be kicked out, recounting doesn't seem like it will help him looking at the margins of votes, which makes it hard for him to actually be able to make a stolen election through the Supreme Courts or something like that. But regardless, this fight for the election has already begun in a lot of court cases and in the streets. And after Trump is kicked out, his movement is not going anywhere. In fact, it will probably get bigger and more empowered. And neither is he. In fact, he will probably run for Republicans again in 2024. So in response to this election, there was civil unrest all over the country, like a lot of people predicted, last week and this week and probably still right now. There were riots in New York Wednesday night on the 4th of November, where there were Black Lives Matter protesters and people protesting the election in general. They were violently attacked by police, and 57 people were arrested as of November 6th. There were groups of Trump supporters in Michigan and in Arizona attempting to force their way into polling stations and voter counting areas. There was unrest in Portland, and the National Guard was already prepared to be deployed and standing by, and there have been 11 arrests as of November 6th. There were also anti-fascist demonstrations in Denver, where again, police violently attacked them. It appears that 8 of those protesters were arrested. I'm just naming a few, but there are dozens of pretty large-scale protests happening. And I'll leave some links to some articles about this election unrest in the description if you want to check them out. I'm sure the protests are still happening right now. I'm not saying they stopped. It's just that the news don't love those subjects too much. But these mass protests and displays of unrest are going to be the new norm in the United States for a while. And frankly, it's about fucking time. Here's an excerpt from an article written by Jacob Croce, or Cross, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, titled Post-Election Protests in U.S. Cities Met with Mass Arrest, which was written on November 6th of this last week. And here's the quote.
At the Maricopa County Election Office in Arizona, hundreds of Trump supporters, some armed with long rifles, threatened election workers while chanting the opposition slogan, "Count that vote." Kim Powell, a local news reporter, was forced to leave the Maricopa counting site after a protester threatened her and demanded to know where she lived. Despite the threatening character of the pro-Trump protests, no arrests were made, and it doesn't appear that police utilized tear gas or rubber bullets against either of the unruly mobs. This stands in stark contrast to the dozens of protests that sprang up in response to Trump's coup maneuvers and self-serving demands to end the vote counting in states where he is ahead and demand that it continues in states where he is trailing.
So it is clear that if you protest from a left-wing perspective, or even a fucking anti-fascist perspective, which is not fundamentally far left necessarily, most people are anti-fascist if you don't know. It's not a specific ideology, it's not fascist. It's being very strongly opposed to fascism. That's most of America. So it is clear that if you protest from a slightly left-wing perspective, or even an anti-fascist perspective, our neo-fascist state will not hesitate to violently respond. The United States is a right-wing political and social hellscape, to be honest. But it seems like more and more people are waking up. This is all product of capitalism, and it is about time we start advancing society for the better and leave this inefficient, inhumane, and unsustainable economic and political system in the past. We need a workers' revolution, and to get there, we need rank and file organization. And more than anything, we need to get people on our side and ready to fight for socialism as quickly as humanly possible. Pennsylvania also had some troubling events unfold as well, where some heavily armed Trump supporters were traveling from my home state of Virginia to Pennsylvania to apparently, quote,
straighten things out.
Because that is the term that the article gave me, which is the term the FBI used when notifying local law enforcement. They were arrested outside the Philadelphia Convention Center Thursday night of last week with loaded handguns, and they also had a semi-automatic weapon in their car with a lot of ammunition, and they are now facing multiple felony and misdemeanor weapon offenses according to the Pennsylvania officials. This article will also be posted in the description of this podcast. This turmoil and political instability and uncertainty is only the beginning. Who knows what will happen with the court cases, because I certainly don't, although I will say it seems unlikely that Trump will be able to steal the election through the courts. That seems very unlikely at this point. But what I do know is that no matter what, Trump and his supporters are going to be a lasting part of our political reality. There will be political unrest in the months and years to come. There is going to be civil unrest, with the pandemic numbers skyrocketing around the world, with our economy continuing to collapse, with our military empire on the verge of world war, and with a homeless crisis that is going to deepen during the freezing winter of January. massive civil unrest should be expected as a result of the continuing worsening of the conditions of the majority. The American empire is falling before our eyes, and it is going to get really ugly in the next decade. I'm really not trying to be a pessimist, but I'm just trying to be honest. And all the evidence points to this. In fact, we are going to have a devastating winter and a devastating 2021 when we see the direction this country is going in. There will be homeless levels that we have never seen anything like. There will be hunger we have never seen before, and there will be death. By the way, this pandemic is hitting new peaks, and the way it looks like the pandemic is going, 2020 is going to look like a great year compared to the rest of the decade. So this is why we have no choice but to fight for a workers' revolution, and I truly believe that. Anyways, that's all I got for you guys today. Those are my thoughts about the aftermath of the election. I'm sure I'll make an episode when something crazy happens with how the whole Trump not conceding the election ends. But other than that, I'm really going to be more back to, foreign policy stuff that the news avoids. And I'm going to be more about boring economic stuff, perhaps, and some more, like Marxist theory type stuff and everything. This workers' revolution is the only hope for America's future, and I fear for our future. I truly do. We don't need to have a homeless crisis unless all of our homes get destroyed, but none of them are getting destroyed. People are getting kicked out of them by private landowners and banks. So, things could be a lot better, guys. If you want to know more about socialism and capitalism or my analysis of the world, check out earlier podcasts and everything. But again, peace, guys. Stay safe, stay vigilant, stay healthy, stay militant. And I will see y'all in 2 weeks about.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Patriotic Communist. All of the music you heard in this podcast was produced and performed by me, Max Rice. And if you would like to check it out, just search Max Rice on any streaming platform. That's MAXRICE. Yes, like the food rice. This is Max Rice signing off.
We're all distracted by media. The misdirection of attention benefits big powers I mentioned. Y'all try to lessen questions and attentions. Money equals power. We gotta kill this connection. These force-fed concepts make no sense. How y'all hating immigrants and we controlled by the 1%. Zombified by screens. Dehumanization comes easily. All I hear are American supremacists, but this line of thought is a normality, full of fallacies while we stay combative overseas. Laws and more laws. As far as I can see, and no one cares because of the mass distractions. We're expected to not question how the government uses our taxes unless it's helping people. That they ramble like that's all to see. Though we need to free the people, we need a fucking hero. We need some MLK, FDR style of change. We're full of pain and ignorant, but won't live in fear. Though we need some yellow vest, bulletproof vests and bold claims. We need that fire in our hearts that can't be tamed. We need to reject and correct our collective violent actions, but it won't happen. Fuck. We're all distracted.